Story 1: The Cabin Watcher. The forest was denser than any of them had expected. As Sam drove the group through winding roads, the tall trees seemed to close in, their canopies weaving together to block out most of the afternoon sunlight. Claire, seated in the passenger seat, stared at the GPS on her phone, squinting as it struggled to maintain a signal. "This can't be right," she muttered. "It's right," Tara said from the back seat, an edge of defensiveness in her voice. "The listing said it was secluded. That's the whole point." Max, sitting next to Tara, smirked. "Secluded is one thing. This feels like the start of a bad horror movie." "Relax," Tara shot back, rolling her eyes. "You'll be thanking me when we're sitting by the fire tonight." Completely off the grid. When they finally arrived, the cabin looked almost exactly like the photos, almost. The pictures hadn't captured the weathered wood, the faint sag of the porch, or the shutters hanging askew. "It's rustic," Eric offered, unloading their bags from the car. "Rustic?" Zoe laughed. "Try borderline condemned." Despite their jokes, there was an undeniable charm to the place. The air smelled of pine and fresh earth, and a nearby creek bubbled softly, breaking the heavy silence of the forest. Tara retrieved the keys from a lockbox and ushered everyone inside. The interior was dim, with thick wooden beams and outdated furnishings. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, its hearth blackened from years of use. The group split up to explore. Guys?" Max's voice echoed from the second floor. Everyone rushed upstairs to find him standing in a small attic room. Dust motes swirled in the pale light streaming through a cracked window. In the center of the room was a wooden chest, its hinges rusted. "Creepy attic?" "Check," Max said, grinning. "What are the odds there's something haunted in there?" "Don't touch it," Claire said immediately. "Just, let's leave it alone." Zoe chuckled. "Relax. It's just a chest. Probably full of moth-eaten quilts or something." Max shrugged and left it untouched, for now. That evening, they lit a fire in the hearth, laughing as they passed around drinks and shared old stories. The atmosphere was light, the earlier unease forgotten. Until the scratching started. It was faint at first, a subtle sound beneath the crackle of the fire. Claire was the first to notice. She stiffened, glancing toward the window. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Sam asked. "That scratching." Everyone paused, listening. There it was again, a faint, irregular scrape, like nails against wood. "Probably just a raccoon," Eric said, leaning back in his chair. "Or something bigger," Max added with a grin. The group chuckled nervously, but no one seemed eager to investigate. Eventually, the sound stopped, and they returned to their conversation, though the laughter was quieter now. The next morning, while the others prepared breakfast, Zoe couldn't resist the attic's pull. She crept upstairs, her curiosity outweighing her apprehension. The chest was surprisingly light when she lifted the lid. Inside was a single item, an old leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked and worn, the edges frayed. Flipping through the pages, Zoe found frantic, nearly illegible handwriting. The entries spoke of sleepless nights, strange noises, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched. One entry stood out. "If you find this, leave. The Watcher does not forgive. The Watcher does not forget." Zoe closed the journal, her stomach twisting. She decided not to tell the others just yet. That night, the scratching returned, louder and more persistent. It moved along the walls, circling the cabin. Tara locked the doors, her face pale. "Okay. That's not a raccoon," she said. "Probably the wind," Eric suggested weakly. "Wind doesn't scratch," Claire snapped. Suddenly, there was a loud thud against the back door. Everyone froze. "Should we check?" Sam whispered. "Hell no," Max replied, gripping a poker from the fireplace. The thudding stopped, replaced by silence so oppressive it made the air feel heavy. Then, the power went out. By the flickering light of the fire, the group huddled together. Zoe finally revealed the journal, reading the passages aloud. "It's just some crazy person," Eric said, though his voice shook. "Crazy enough to live out here and mess with us?" Max countered, as if in response. The scratching resumed. This time, it was accompanied by a faint tapping at the windows. Claire glanced toward the nearest one and screamed. A shadowy figure stood just outside, its outline barely visible in the firelight. "Everyone upstairs," Tara shouted. They scrambled up the narrow staircase, barricading themselves in one of the bedrooms. The scratching followed them, now coming from the bedroom door. "Do you think it can get in?" Zoe whispered, as if answering her question. The door handle began to turn. The door burst open, revealing nothing. The hallway was empty. "Okay. I'm done," Max said, grabbing a flashlight. "We're leaving." "You can't be serious," Tara said. "It's pitch black out there. And it's not safe in here." Reluctantly, the group agreed, armed with flashlights and anything they could use as a weapon. They ventured into the night. The forest was eerily silent, the air thick with tension. Every rustle of leaves, every snapped twig, sent their hearts racing. Behind them, the cabin's windows glowed faintly, though no one had left the fire burning. As they neared the car, a guttural growl stopped them in their tracks. From the shadows emerged the figure, its shape human but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its eyes glinting like wet stones in the darkness. "It's not human," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. The group ran, weaving through the trees. The figure pursued them, its movements unnaturally fast and fluid. Zoe tripped, her flashlight clattering to the ground. The figure loomed over her. But before it could strike, Max hurled a rock at its head. "Go," he shouted, dragging Zoe to her feet. They reached the car just as the first hints of dawn painted the sky. Eric fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and they sped down the dirt road, leaving the cabin and the figure behind. Back home, they tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a prank, they told themselves. Maybe their minds had played tricks in the isolation. But weeks later, when Sam woke to find faint scratches on his bedroom window, he realized the truth: the Watcher had followed them. Story 2: The Mirror's Secret. The estate sale wasn't on Emma's agenda that day. She had planned to run errands and maybe stop for coffee. But the handwritten sign caught her attention: estate sale, antiques, furniture, and more. Something about the word antiques intrigued her. She wasn't one for collecting, but her new house felt sparse. lacking a sense of charm. When she arrived, Emma was overwhelmed by the variety of items displayed across the sprawling property. Vases, jewelry, books, and furniture filled the rooms. It wasn't until she entered the study that she saw the mirror. It stood taller than her, with a gilded frame carved in an intricate floral design. The glass was impossibly clean, reflecting the room with an almost unnatural clarity. Something about it felt alive, as if it was watching her. "How much for the mirror?" she asked the seller, a middle-aged woman with a practiced smile. "Oh, that piece. It's been here forever. A real antique," the woman said, her voice lowering slightly. "You can have it for $150. Emma hesitated, sensing the hesitation in the woman's voice. But the mirror was too beautiful to pass up. She handed over the cash and arranged for it to be delivered to her house. The mirror arrived the following afternoon, carefully unloaded by two movers. Emma directed them to place it in the living room. As soon as it was set in place, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The room felt colder, the air heavier. Emma brushed the feeling off. She had a lot to do, decorating, organizing, and settling into her new home with her 5-year-old son, Charlie. That evening, Emma admired the mirror as she sipped tea. The gilded frame caught the soft glow of the lamps, and the glass reflected the room with a stunning sharpness. Yet, as she stared, something felt off. She thought she saw movement in the reflection, a fleeting shadow darting behind her. Emma turned quickly, her pulse racing. But the room was still. She laughed nervously, convincing herself it was a trick of the light. It wasn't long before Emma's unease grew. The first unsettling event happened late at night. Emma had fallen asleep on the couch after a long day of unpacking. She woke to a faint giggling sound, light and childlike. Groggy. She looked around, expecting to see Charlie out of bed. But he wasn't there. The giggling continued, faint but distinct, and seemed to echo from the mirror. Emma stared at it, her breath catching as she thought she saw the faint outline of two children in the reflection. "Charlie," she called out, her voice shaky. The figures vanished. Heart pounding, Emma went upstairs to check on her son. He was fast asleep, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Relieved, she returned to the living room. But the mirror seemed darker somehow, its frame less lustrous. The following morning, Emma tried to put the incident out of her mind. But things grew stranger. Charlie, usually chatty, became quiet and withdrawn. At breakfast, he pushed his cereal around the bowl, his eyes darting toward the living room. "Is something wrong, sweetheart?" Emma asked. Charlie looked up, his face pale. "The kids in the mirror were playing last night." Emma froze. "What kids?" "The boy and the girl," he said simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Emma's heart skipped a beat, but she forced a smile. "You probably dreamed it. Mirrors can be funny sometimes." Charlie shrugged, but his gaze lingered on the living room, his small body tense. A week later, Emma was in the kitchen preparing dinner when it happened again. She caught a glimpse of movement in the microwave's reflective surface. A man stood behind her. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow, staring directly at her. Emma spun around, her heart racing. But the kitchen was empty. Her hands trembled as she clutched the countertop. Was she losing her mind? That night, Emma couldn't sleep. Every creak and whisper of the house set her on edge. She tried to rationalize the events, but the fear gnawed at her. Emma's breaking point came when Charlie began talking to someone in his room. "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" she asked, peeking in. "Annabelle," he replied without hesitation. "She says she lives in the mirror. She's sad because her brother can't find her." Emma's blood ran cold. She removed every mirror from Charlie's room that night. The next day, she called the estate sale organizer to learn more about the mirror's history. "It came from the Harrington estate," the woman said after a pause. "The family had an unusual past. Samuel Harrington disappeared after his wife and children were found dead in their home. It's a tragic story." Emma's stomach churned. "Do you know anything about the mirror?" "Not really. But some people say it belonged to Samuel. They say he spent hours staring into it before he vanished." Emma ended the call, her hands trembling. The mirror's presence became unbearable. Emma began hearing whispers at night, faint and unintelligible. Objects near the mirror moved subtly, a vase tipping over, a picture frame sliding slightly out of place. One night, Emma woke to the sound of Charlie screaming. She bolted into the living room to find him standing before the mirror, his hands pressed against the glass. His reflection didn't match his movements, it stared at him, unblinking. "Charlie!" Emma screamed, pulling him away. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and a pale hand emerged, clawing at the air. Emma grabbed a blanket and threw it over the mirror, her heart pounding. But the blanket didn't stay. It slipped to the floor, as though pushed off by an unseen force. Emma called a local historian for help, desperate for answers. She learned that Samuel Harrington had been suspected of murdering his family, though no evidence ever surfaced. Some believed he had trapped their souls in the mirror before disappearing himself. The final night was a nightmare. Emma woke to find the mirror glowing faintly, the reflection showing not her living room but a dark, blood-streaked corridor. A figure stepped into view. It was Samuel Harrington. His hollow eyes locked onto her as he raised a hand, beckoning. Emma grabbed a fireplace poker and swung it at the mirror with all her strength. The glass shattered, the shards scattering across the room. But as they hit the floor, the fragments began to move, dragging themselves back toward the frame. The house filled with an ear-piercing scream, a sound so chilling it felt as though it were tearing through her very soul. Emma scooped up Charlie and fled the house. Emma and Charlie moved in with her sister, leaving the house and its horrors behind. When she returned weeks later with movers to collect her belongings, the mirror was gone. The final scene reveals the mirror at another estate sale, its frame polished and gleaming. A young couple admires it, unaware of its dark history. "It's perfect," the woman says. The man nods. "Let's take it." As they load the mirror into their car, its surface ripples faintly, a faint outline of Samuel Harrington's face appearing briefly before vanishing. Story 3: The Shadow at the Lake. The lake's surface mirrored the fading light of the day, its stillness broken only by the faint ripple of a passing breeze. Towering pines circled the shore like silent sentinels, their reflections stretching deep into the water. To the group of 5 campers, Jake, Sam, Lila, Ryan, and Marcy, it was everything they'd hoped for. "This place is perfect," Marcy said, stepping out of the car and stretching. "It better be," Jake replied, tossing a bag over his shoulder. "Took forever to find this spot." Sam was already unloading the tents, eager to set up before darkness fell. The group had planned this weekend for months, a reprieve from their hectic city lives, filled with late nights, demanding jobs, and constant noise. Here, in the remote wilderness, they'd have none of that, just the serenity of nature. As the sun dipped lower, the group worked together to pitch their tents near the shore. The campsite was secluded, with no other campers in sight. A fire crackled to life as they settled into their chairs, passing around marshmallows and telling stories. The first sign of something wrong came as a faint sound, a soft splashing on the lake's surface. Fish? Sam guessed, craning his neck to see. But the water was calm, undisturbed save for the faint ripples that spread in lazy circles. Probably, Jake said dismissively. Or a frog. As the night wore on, the splashing faded, replaced by the chirping of crickets. But even as they laughed and drank, Marcy couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching. The morning brought golden sunlight filtering through the trees. The group woke early, energized by the fresh air. Sam and Jake decided to explore the shoreline while Marcy, Lila, and Ryan stayed back to make breakfast. The lake was even more stunning in the daylight. The water was so clear they could see the rocky bottom near the shore. Fish darted beneath the surface, their scales catching the light. But their tranquility shattered when Sam stopped abruptly. "Jake, look at this." On the soft, muddy bank were footprints, bare, human-like, but long and narrow, with toes that seemed to curl unnaturally. "That's weird," Jake muttered, crouching to examine them. "Maybe someone else is camping nearby." "No way," Sam said. "We'd have seen them on the drive up. These prints, they're fresh." The footprints trailed down to the water, disappearing into the lake. Sam's unease deepened. Whoever had left them hadn't come back out. When they returned to the campsite, their discovery cast a shadow over breakfast. Marcy suggested they move to another location, but Jake laughed it off. "Guys, it's probably just some hiker or a fisherman," he said, trying to sound confident. "We're overthinking it." Still, the group couldn't shake their unease. That night, the atmosphere was different. The fire's crackling seemed louder in the silence, and the trees around them felt more imposing. As they sat around the flames, swapping jokes and stories, the faint sound of splashing returned. Lila tensed. There it is again. Everyone fell silent, straining their ears. The splashing was rhythmic, almost deliberate, as if something was moving through the water. Jake grabbed his flashlight and shone it toward the lake. "See? Nothing." But as the light danced across the water, Marcy gasped. "There," she whispered, pointing. At the far edge of the beam, a figure stood at the water's edge. It was barely visible, its outline blending into the dark. The group froze, staring. "Who's out there?" Jake called. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its head tilted slightly as if watching them. "Probably just some weirdo," Jake muttered, lowering the flashlight. "Ignore it. They'll leave." But the figure didn't leave. It lingered, motionless, until the group finally retreated to their tents. The following day, unease hung heavy over the campsite. The group tried to shake it off, exploring the woods and swimming in the lake. But the mood had shifted. That evening, as the sun set, Lila noticed something alarming. "Guys, the footprints. They're back." The prints were in the same spot as before but now seemed closer to the campsite. "That's it," Marcy said, her voice trembling. "We need to leave." But Jake refused. "We drove 3 hours to get here. I'm not running off because of some footprints." The group reluctantly agreed to stay another night, though their nerves were frayed. As darkness fell, the splashing returned, louder this time. And then came a new sound, a faint, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate in the air. "Jake! What the hell is that?" Ryan whispered. Jake didn't answer. He was gripping his flashlight tightly, his knuckles white. When the growling stopped, it was replaced by the sound of something moving through the trees. Twigs snapped, and leaves rustled. "It's circling us," Lila whispered. The group huddled closer to the fire, their eyes darting toward the shadows. And then they saw it, the figure standing just beyond the firelight. Its outline clearer now. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and unnatural. "Stay back," Jake shouted, grabbing a log from the fire and holding it like a weapon. The figure tilted its head again, then slowly retreated into the darkness. The group barely slept that night, jumping at every sound. When dawn broke, they discovered Ryan's tent was empty. "Ryan?" Lila called, her voice rising in panic. They searched the campsite, then the shoreline. His jacket and flashlight were found floating in the shallows, but there was no sign of him. "I'm calling for help," Marcy said, pulling out her phone. But there was no signal. "Okay. Let's just pack up and leave," Jake said, his bravado finally cracking. The group hurriedly packed their belongings and piled into the 2 cars. But when they tried to start the engines, nothing happened. "You've got to be kidding me," Jake muttered, turning the key over and over. "It's not just the cars," Sam said, holding up his dead phone. "Nothing's working." The realization hit them all at once, they were trapped. That night, the figure grew bolder. It appeared closer, standing just outside the circle of tents. Its presence was oppressive, the air around it seeming to hum with malice. Then came the screams. Marcy was the first to hear it, a blood-curdling wail that pierced the stillness. It was Ryan's voice. "He's alive," she shouted, running toward the sound. "Marcy! Stop!" Jake yelled, chasing after her. But as Marcy reached the shore, she froze. The figure was there, standing in the water, holding something, a crumpled piece of Ryan's clothing. It raised its head, and for the first time, the group saw its face, or what passed for a face. It was hollow, featureless, its surface like swirling smoke. Marcy screamed, stumbling back. The figure dropped the clothing and began to move toward her, its limbs bending at impossible angles. Jake grabbed Marcy and pulled her back toward the fire. "Stay together," he shouted. The group huddled around the flames, their only source of protection. The figure circled them, its hollow face watching. As dawn approached, the figure retreated, melting back into the lake. "We're leaving now," Jake said. The group decided to abandon the cars and hike back to civilization. They packed only the essentials and set off down the narrow trail, their nerves frayed. But the figure wasn't done with them. As they walked, they heard it, the guttural growl. Closer now. The shadow appeared in the trees, moving parallel to them. Its movements unnaturally smooth. "Run!" Jake shouted. The group broke into a sprint, the shadow gliding effortlessly after them. When they finally reached the main road, they collapsed in exhaustion, too terrified to speak. A passing truck stopped, and the driver offered them a ride back to town. Ryan was never found, his disappearance labeled a tragic accident. The group vowed never to speak of the shadow again. But the memories haunted them. Months later, Marcy woke in the middle of the night to a faint sound. Splashing. She froze, her eyes darting to the window. There, in the moonlight, was a shadowy figure, its head tilted as it watched her. The story ends with a chilling thought: the shadow was not bound to the lake. It followed those it claimed, and it was still watching. As the final scene unfolds in the cabin watcher, the group finally speeds away from the eerie cabin. They reach safety, but the lingering dread follows them like an unshakable shadow. Days turn into weeks, and though they try to rationalize their terror as a freak coincidence, Sam's awakening to scratches on his bedroom window suggests the horrifying truth: the watcher is not bound by the cabin's walls. But what would you do if the terror followed you home? Have you ever experienced something so inexplicably chilling that it made you question your safety in your own home? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wolf Tells for more bone-chilling stories. And remember, what you leave behind might just follow you home.